The White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, leaving a lot of historians in an uproar, and other people as well, after saying this about the Civil War.
I would tell you that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man. He was a man that gave up his country to fight for his state, which in 150 years ago was more important than country. It was always loyalty to state first back in those days. Now it's different today. But the lack of an ability to compromise led to the Civil War. And men and women of good faith on both sides made their stand where their conscience had them make their stand.
The White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders refusing for 2 days in a row to clarify Kelly's remarks. So joining me now is CNN political analyst April Ryan, White House correspondent for the American Urban Radio Networks, and Tim Wise, the author of White Like Me. Welcome to the program. Wow, a lot to discuss. So Tim, you say that General John Kelly is either ignorant or he knows he is wrong and he is pandering to President Trump's base. I have to ask you, which is it? Which is worse, though?
Well, it could be either, and they're both horrible. I mean, he's either ignorant or he's pandering. The ignorance is very clear. No historian would believe his argument that somehow a lack of compromise is why there was a civil war. The folks who seceded from the Union and decided to launch that war made it very clear why they were doing it. And they said that it was to preserve white supremacy. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said that the cornerstone of the new government was the great truth that the, quote, Negro is not the equal of the white man. So they went to war and seceded to preserve a system of white supremacy. They said so. And I have to assume John Kelly knows that, which makes me believe that what he's doing is pandering to a subset of Donald Trump's base that revels in neo-Confederacy and literally takes a bath in the politics of white rage and grievance. And that's why you saw the Confederate flag at Trump rallies all during the campaign, even outside of the South. There is a part of his base that loves this. So I have to assume that John Kelly is not the adult we were told he was when he was brought into the White House, because he is saying absurd, fundamentally ridiculous things, pandering to a group of people who are very much bought into the politics of white racial grievance and love that stuff.
The White House is standing by General Kelly's comments denying that they were offensive. April, you tried to ask Sarah Sanders about this, and as she was leaving the briefing room yesterday. Watch this.
Thanks so much, guys. Hope you have a happy and safe Halloween. Thanks, guys.
Wow. And then here's your exchange with Sarah Sanders earlier today.
What is the definition of compromise as it relates to slavery and the Civil War?
Look, I'm not going to get in and relitigate the Civil War. It's like I told you yesterday. I think I've addressed the concerns that a lot of people had and the questions that you had.
The question is, does this administration believe, does this president believe slavery was wrong? And before you answer, Mary Frances Berry, a historian, said, in 1860, there was a compromise. The compromise was to have southern states keep slavery, but the Confederacy fired on Fort Sumter that caused the Civil War. And because of the Civil War, what happened? The North won.
I think it is disgusting and absurd to suggest that anyone inside of this building would support slavery.
So she didn't really answer your... So what they're doing is disgusting. What is she saying?
It was disgusting for me to even raise the question.
I thought she was referring to them. I mean, by that, because she's doing exactly what she said. What does she mean, relitigating the Civil War? I mean, all you have to do is pick up a history book. You know, everyone knows what the Civil War is about. There's no relitigating.
Slavery. And yesterday, and this is why I asked, because she didn't call on me yesterday, and she was picking all around me, but the issue is, when she did give answers to the reporters, there were answers like, you know, many of the presidents are flawed. All the presidents have flaws, all of them. So let's go there, in one way or the other. And there are regrets afterwards. You know, we've heard that from many presidents.
And she said our leaders
so all the
are
presidents
flawed,
have
right?
flaws. She never answered. She called out presidents as well. She named some. Now, Yeah. So then, you know, she was continually asked, she didn't want to get into it. But then she said she blamed us as the media, saying that we're trying to make this racial. The issue is the Civil War. One of the main reasons why the Civil War was fought because of slavery. She just kept on going down this line, and I never heard an answer to the definition of compromise. So that's why I said, and then you have all this other stuff going on when the administration is supporting those who are supporting the Confederate statues, etc. So there was still confusion. So I asked a simple question: as they're supporting the Confederacy and these statues, and Robert E. Lee, General Kelly saying, Robert E. Lee, do you think slavery was wrong? That is a legitimate question. It wasn't to be smart or anything, and I wasn't trying to attack her.
April, we
or
get
make
that.
any
Of course it's
assertions.
a legitimate
I was asking
question.
a legitimate question.
Of course it's a legitimate question, and it's a very simple answer. She could have said, yes, absolutely, we believe that slavery is wrong. But she can't, because she's in a tough spot, because she has to defend someone who says that Robert E. Lee put the state over the country at that time. I think that's the definition of treason there. Compromise on what? And on both sides. Tim, I know you want to jump in here, but let me just give you this quote, and then you can take it away. Historian Frank Carrillo writes for the Washington Post, the White House loves a both sides narrative, especially one that conceals the vile racism of one side's ideology. Is that the problem here?
That is the problem, but what's really ironic is you have John Kelly actually making excuses for a bunch of people who fired on and killed hundreds of thousands of men who wore the uniform that he wears now. It is unbelievably pathetic that a four-star general would make that, and to say that the reason we ought not criticize them is because we're using today's moral standards. Excuse me, we have a moral standard going back to the Ten Commandments that says thou shalt not steal. Well, slavery was rooted in kidnapping and the theft of black bodies and black labor. That's not a new moral standard. That's been around since God handed the tablets to Moses. So I think probably John Kelly went to catechism class as a good Catholic boy in Boston. Maybe he needs to refresh his not only historical but biblical memory.
Why are they trying to whitewash history here?
Well, I think because they know that there are people in that subset of his support who have always supported that reactionary narrative, and they're pandering to them. I think it is very much about race. It is about playing to that group.
Yeah.
April, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah. Bottom line, it's about, as Tim said, it's about pandering to that group. But you have to remember, when they pander to that group, there are people that are upset. The NAACP is upset, saying you can't take principles and change them. You can't deal with issues of slavery and talk about a compromise when the compromise, like Mary Frances Berry said, who's a historian and the former head of the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights, she said that in 1860, the compromise was to let Southern states have slavery. That was the compromise. But the South, the Confederacy, fired on Fort Sumter, which started the Civil War.
Yeah.
And we know what happened.
Yeah.
So that was the compromise. And the question is, does General Kelly realize that was what happened? And if so, which side of history does he really stand on?
Thank you both.
He brought this up. We didn't bring it up.
Thank you both. I appreciate the conversation. Tim, good to see you again. April, I'll see you
Good to see you.
When we come back, is this the real John Kelly we're seeing? And could he cause real problems for Trump's presidency? The White House standing by the Chief of Staff, John Kelly's shocking comments about the Civil War. Let's discuss now. Joseph Pinion's here. He is a Republican strategist. CNN political commentators Anna Navarro, Bakari Sellers, and Alice Stewart. Here we go. More from General Kelly.
Robert E. Lee was an honorable man. He was a man that gave up his country to fight for his state, which in 150 years ago was more important than country. It was always loyalty to state first back in those days. Now it's different today.
Bakari, Robert E. Lee, an honorable man?
Well, I think that the Chief of Staff is giving Robert E. Lee the benefit of history, to say the least. You know, I was thinking to myself that I really don't have time to be explaining to people the root cause of the Civil War and whether or not Robert E. Lee was a great man. In fact, in 2017, I can't believe that we're even having those discussions. I mean, the reason that Robert E. Lee was fighting for the state was for slavery and the expansion thereof. I don't understand why the White House wants to double down other than talking to portions of their base which adhere to these vile, old-fashioned rhetoric that was more divisive than we want to even deal with. I mean, if we have to talk about why the Civil War was fought, will we ever get to the real discussion of race in this country and how to bring this country together? For me, I have a great deal of respect for the Chief of Staff, for General Kelly. However, you lose respect for individuals when they tend to pervert history or just show a pure ignorance thereof.
But is that maybe the issue, as some I've heard, and even some of our colleagues here, contributors, saying that many people may have been blinded by the uniform when it comes to, General Kelly, that because as it turns out, a lot of he sounds a lot like Bannon.
Well, no, I think that first and foremost with General Kelly, I think it's just kind of his turn at the plate. So, I mean, first, there can never be a compromise on human subjugation. And I think that when you start talking about that, that's why people like April Ryan feel compelled to ask if this administration is against slavery. I think that when you look at the trajectory here, it happened with Sean Spicer. I think it happened with Reince Priebus. Anytime this president asks somebody to step out onto a limb for him, he then proceeds to take a chainsaw to the branch. That is what happens.
But if you don't believe that, that doesn't come out of your mouth. I mean, come on.
I don't think so, though.
I don't. Look, sometimes people say things on live TV that then they regret. I've known John Kelly. I've known John Kelly, the John Kelly in Miami, the guy who was the commander, the Southcom commander. Part of his job included being the top military diplomat, if you'd like, with the Western Hemisphere, which included the Caribbean islands. I can tell you that his colleagues there in Latin America and the Caribbean island, many of them African descent, liked him, respected him, and it was mutual. In Miami, he was a conciliatory leader. He was part of a very diverse community. The John Kelly I've seen the last 3 weeks is, I think, the one, that functions within the Trump White House. People misremember. He misremembered the Frederica Wilson event. People misspeak. John Kelly's not ignorant. Four-star generals go to war college. They study war. He knows slavery, it cost the, damn Civil War.
Why would he say it?
I think he wanted to make a point about compromise and bring it on today. The problem is that he has misremembered, he has misspoken, he has been divisive, he has been offensive, particularly to African Americans, and because he's in this White House, he's incapable of apologizing and admitting a mistake.
I don't know about that. I think if you don't believe it, you don't say it. And I think that, listen, even some of those people down there who are carrying tiki torches, they have jobs, they have to work with people of color, but that's not what they believe in their personal lives. Go ahead, Alice.
Don, I think what we're seeing is that Chief of Staff Kelly is a lot more like Donald Trump than we thought when he went into this position. And he clearly is there to be the gatekeeper for the president and limit the amount of incoming flow of information that the president has. But also at the end of the day, he's the Chief of Staff. He answers to the Chief, Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, and three things that are top of his agenda. He will defend the president, he will work to deliver on his policies, and in the end, he will double down if he says something that is offensive or something that, if he happens to misremember something that is an important part of history. And I think we saw that with regard to the Robert E. Lee statement, and certainly with regard to Congressman Wilson.
Can we do it on the other side of the break?
Yeah, because here's the question.
Let's do it on the other side of the break, because I got to take a break. We'll talk, so you mentioned Frederica Wilson. We'll talk about that controversy as well. We'll be right back. Back now with my panel, and Ana Navarro wanted to make a point on compromise. What were you saying?
Yeah, forget compromise. My point is, you know what this White House is excellent at? Diversion, distraction, pivoting. So instead of talking about the fact that 3 Trump world members, 2 are indicted and 1 has pled guilty, we're talking about a cultural controversy. They do this over and over and over again. Listen, Don, shiny objects, they come in all shapes and sizes, baby. Sometimes they're white, balding, former 4-star generals. Yeah. We are chasing this shiny object instead of focusing on Russia, 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 which they don't want us to focus on because they're incredibly vulnerable and it's not going to go away.
Listen, I agree with you. And listen,
I told you we were going to agree.
24 hours and then, we have 23 and a half plus whatever to talk about something. We have, 10 minutes to talk about something else. And something I think that's very important. A 4-star general. Listen, I have to disagree with you guys. I don't think that this is about standing up for Donald Trump. I think that if you have to believe this to say it. If you don't believe it, you don't say it. I don't believe there's a compromise on racism. I don't believe there's a compromise on misogyny. I don't believe there's a compromise on sexual harassment. I don't believe that there is a compromise when it comes to anti-Semitism. It's either a no or a yes. I believe that it's wrong or not. You don't try to draw two comparisons between any of those things.
Yeah, I mean,
But Don, if I may, let me just tell you how ahistorical it is, and for a four-star general to give this. In fact, throughout that time period, we actually had compromises. We had the 3/5 compromise. We had the Missouri compromise. Hell, Abraham Lincoln even compromised with slavery. He just didn't want the expansion thereof. And so the whole statement was ahistorical. But I'm here in Tallahassee today, and I was with Mayor Gillum and others, and we were talking about diversity and inclusion. And it's very hard to talk about these substantive policy issues if the President of the United States and his White House don't even know why we had the Civil War. So we're trying to have policy discussions and bring people together. In the White House again, and Anna's right to a point, because they're not focusing on diversion per se as much as they're focused on divisiveness. The longer we stay divided as a country, the more Donald Trump flourishes.
Yeah. Hey, let's can we talk about Frederica Wilson, please? Because I only have a minute left, Allison. I'll give you the first word on it. The tape shows what it shows, and that he was wrong about what she said at that dedication ceremony, and he says he's not going to apologize. What do you think of that?
I think it's unfortunate. I mean, and clearly he didn't remember exactly what she said, the way she said it, but the tapes don't lie. And the things that she said, she wasn't taking credit for funding the FBI building. She shared the gratitude for the building being built in the first place, and clearly he misremembered. And I think that's unfortunate that instead of
that activity,
I think that is the matter of the Chinese decision. I think we should continue to convince Chinese government that North Korean nuclear threat.
Talking about this more than a week after the fact, and I think that is unfortunate. But the real misfortune in all this, we're talking about divisiveness, we're still talking about Florida victims, we're still talking about Civil War. We should be talking about tax reform. That's the big rollout tomorrow, and we're not talking about that because we have Russia hanging over our head and divisiveness.
I mean, we can't have a conversation about tax reform because we have to now at least confront the reality. This president does not want to have the conversation about tax reform. He doesn't want to talk about health care. The agenda is the cultural issue. This president has been fighting the cultural war in plain sight his entire life. Whether you're going back to the Central Park Five, whether you start talking about the fact that it was Japanese currency manipulation before it was Chinese currency manipulation, that is what he wants to fight. And the deeper issue is that we as a nation have not invested the emotional capital to confront the very real issue of racism in this nation. And that is why that even in spite of the fact that we can sit here and have an honest discourse about the fact that there can be no compromise on human subjugation, there are many Americans who still do not understand fundamentally the things that still ail us this day.
I've got to run. I got to get to the next hour. Thank you all. I appreciate it. Fascinating conversation.
Thanks,
I'll see you soon. This is CNN Tonight. I'm Don Lemon. Thanks for joining us.